Can't see everyone else.
Good, that's good. Are we live? Yes. Everybody's muted. Good morning and welcome to our eighth Social Work Day on the Hill, celebrating the many contributions social workers have made and are still making in Congress and the federal government. It began in 2016 with former Congressman Ed Towns' idea of bringing social workers to the Hill to recognize our work to create policies and laws to help those who need it the most. March is Social Work Month and Women's History Month, and coincidentally, this year's program falls on the International Day of the Woman. Again, coincidentally, but also significantly, all of this year's honorees are women. Our morning panel, moderated by an amazing woman, Dr. Darcy Merritt, a full professor at the Crown School of Social Work at the University of Chicago, features other amazing women who will talk about their work on the front lines of the struggle to preserve and strengthen democracy. We also included a male, uh, Chris Board President Justin Hodge, to add a little balance. The panelists are members of the board of the Social Work Democracy Project. You can find out more about who they are and what they do by going to the Chris Wetz website at www.chrisinc.org. At 1 p.m., I will moderate a discussion of young social workers who will give their perspectives on social work's role in the political arena. So, without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Darcy Merritt.
Myself. Greetings, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for that lovely introduction. I'm really happy to be here with my colleagues who I've presented with before, talking about a really critical issue, democracy, and just really needing to highlight all of the work that's already being done in the social work political space and civic engagement. And so I just want to acknowledge their greatness, all four of them, and we're going to not spend any time on extensive bios with them because we want to get straight to the conversation. So I'm going to begin, if it's okay with all, by asking everybody, how did you really get involved in political social work and civic engagement in the first place? Like, what led you to this work and navigating these spaces? And I can't see everybody, so I'm just going to let folks, whoever wants to
Maybe you
jump
should
into that question first.
call on us.
Okay. All right, there, now I can see everybody. All right, well, then I'll start with you, Dr. Abramowitz. I'll ask you, what do you think about the threats to democracy?
Well, you want me to start with how I got involved, right? So
Yes,
I should
please.
start there. Yeah.
Mhm.
I'll talk about that after that. So, um, well, I probably have a few years on most people in this room, which I'm very proud of. I'm a child of the 60s and 70s. And during that time, the civil rights movement and others fought for and won the right to vote that had been denied to people of color, especially Black people, since the end of Reconstruction in the late 1870s. And then more recently, voter suppression raised its ugly head. And that really broke my heart because I had been quite active in the civil rights movement in the old days. So in 2018, when I was asked to co-lead the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign, better known as Voting is Social Work, I jumped. I just jumped at the chance. So why did I do that? That's how his movement, the anti-war movement and the labor movement and the civil rights movement as I was growing up. Um, but when the times changed and when I was asked to play this role, why did I do it? Well, it was something I could do from my perch in the academy where I then was. Um, I'm also known as a scholar and an activist. So that because I've been writing about social policy and social change and also about social movements. And so I just want to say I'm a strong believer in social movements because I think these movements that many people participated in, are really responsible for most of the major social change that has happened during the 20th century. And so I just want to say two more things. I want to back up what I just said. I want to quote Frederick Douglass, who said, "There is no progress without struggle." And he said, "Power seeks nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will." And that's what those movements were doing. The collective demand made the change. But the context has changed now. During that time, we were in a quasi-liberal environment, and the policy and the politicians were more or less, many not so, but more or less on our side. The conditions were a little riper for social change. Well, the world has changed a lot since then, and so we have to get smart. We have to change our strategies. We have to figure out how to get the changes we want, how to make the demands we want, and be successful in a context when our opponents are changing the very structures that we need in order to, for example, vote. So that's what I'm doing. I got involved because of who I was when the social movements are around, and I see what I'm doing now as contributing to that once again.
Thank you so much. So who would like to share next how you became involved in this work?
Okay, I'll go since no one else was jumping at it.
From now on, I'm going to call on people.
Yeah, I actually wrote some notes because Mimi made me think about writing my notes down because she's always prepared. And so I took a page from her book, and I just wrote down my thoughts. And so my interest in political social work began even before I was born. My father enrolled in Rutgers School of Social Work in 1966, the year I was born. And he was a part of those social movements that Mimi spoke about. And so, 2 months into the world, here I am, already being a social worker with Dad at marches, at movements, in the stroller. My entire life, I watched my dad work as a community leader, working with civic organizations, working at a settlement house, advocating for educational equity, as an administrator in the public school system, and then ultimately being an elected official for over 25 years in city government. So I studied my dad and how he used his social work degree to bring about change in many different settings. His inspiration led me to get my political science degree and an MSW from his alma mater, Rutgers. So I followed my dad's footsteps. But now I am an associate professor of professional practice, but academia was not my goal. My goal was to be like my dad, was to create change. And so, yesterday my daughter asked me, she said, "Well, Mom, what exactly is political social work?" And then I just explained to her, it's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. I started on my first campaign at the age of 9. So that's going back 45 years. But I was 9 years old, door knocking and doing literature drops for a candidate that my dad identified as someone that he thought would be great in Congress. And then I worked on campaigns ever since. I cannot remember an election that I have not worked on getting out the vote or working at the polls. And so at the age of 16, I was managing volunteers on campaigns and, just very involved and engaged because I knew that if people got involved in the political space, they would also get involved in their civic associations and they would also be involved in the PTA. But I learned all of that around the kitchen table. Everyone doesn't have that kind of conversation at the kitchen table. I did every night. How can we do more for our community? When I finished getting my degree at Rutgers, I made some social work moves, working in nonprofit and doing the traditional route of an administration, policy, and planning social worker. But I didn't have power. And I realized that I could create a bigger change if I go back to the place where I knew the players, and that was Delaware. So I moved back to Delaware in 2005, and I had on my checklist 3 things: where I was going to live, where I wanted my kids to go to school, and the last thing was to work for Joe Biden. At the time, he was our US Senator, and there was not an opening in his office, but I knew that he was the most powerful person in the state and one of the most powerful people on the Hill at that time. I contacted individuals in his office and said, hey, I'm coming back to Delaware. And at that time, I knew almost everybody in office because as a kid, I worked on all of their campaigns. And so from there, I was hired. An opening became available in Biden's office. I was hired as a projects assistant, which meant that I was the liaison between the community and the office. And from nonprofits to federal dollars, I was that person that really connected, people and problems to resources. In that role, I was pretty effective, and the office also made me the director of constituent services, so that I could look at the cases that were coming to the office and then really connect them to policy, to the Washington office. I was in that position for a good while, but then I jumped over into campaigning again, because in 2008, I was given the opportunity to work on the Obama presidential campaign as a state director. That campaign changed my life because it helped me to have hope again, that we could really get young people involved, that we could really be at the table, that we could make things happen. And I still have that hope today. So, I mean, there are multiple other things that have happened in this process, but I came to this work because I know that this work matters. I've seen it from the age of 10, that if people are involved and engaged, they can get the things that they want for their community. And I'm involved in it to this very day. But I also know that we need more social workers in this space. And so that's what led me to academia, that as a professor of professional practice, I wanted students graduating understanding a commitment to social justice and social change. And I also wanted to demystify the political space for them, that they saw that it was possible for us to be in these rooms, not just advocating outside asking for change, but actually running for office or working on these staffs, researching and providing advice and guidance. So that's what I do. I try to model for students how political social work looks, and I try to inspire social workers to take this same path. So that's my origin story.
And that's powerful. Thank you so much, Marla. And because it's International Women's Day, I'm going to go to Louisa next. Sorry, Justin.
Thank you, Dr. Merritt, and thank you everybody who's watching at home. I got into this work really along the same wavelengths as Marla got into it because of my mom, because I saw firsthand her being a recipient of social work services, of social services in our community. She was a person who had to use the resources locally in her local community space, in her local mental health clinic, in her local community-based organization to really access the resources that she needed to have her family survive and then thrive in uptown New York. So I knew from a very early age that I wanted to do work that impacted my community, that impacted people that looked like me and sounded like me in New York City. And I realized pretty early on that I wanted to make change, but I wanted to make change for the largest amount of people in the shortest amount of time. Because that is really the way that social movements begin, that people can have equity in the most important parts of their lives, in their jobs, in their education, in where they live and how they live, in their public safety, and all of these other things. So I came to social work school after already having worked within the community as a family support worker, doing direct service for a number of years. and realizing right off the bat that if I wanted to make that change as quickly as possible in our community, I needed to get into macro social work. I needed to get into the advocacy space, and I needed to get in front of people that were stakeholders and decision makers at the top levels of our local and state government. So I went to NYU. I'm a proud alum of the NYU Silver School of Social Work, where I was lucky enough to engage with a number of mentors and professors that really gave me the opportunity to polish up and to build up my advocacy skills, even within the school. I think that's really important. And for any students that are watching now, I really encourage you to take up that leadership mantle wherever you are, because those are skills that you're going to utilize once you're done with your schooling. And once you get into those positions of power and those rooms of power that Marla was talking about, you're really going to need those skills. So even while I was at NYU, I was already honing my ability to get into a room, to command a room, and to change minds, which is really, really important. After graduation, I entered the advocacy space. I went to work for my local congressman in New York City, Congressman Serrano, which was an incredible experience as a policy fellow to be able to bring my knowledge, my expertise as a resident of the Bronx, to help craft his message, to help craft his action on local issues like the opioid crisis, like youth homelessness. These are all very, very real issues that I experienced just living where I live. And I was able to bring the advocacy skills that I learned in school into that space to craft legislation and to craft action around those issues. I've held a number of positions in local government since then. I served as chief of staff in the New York City Council, which was very powerful and really allowed me to be a resource, a guide, and an expert on the issues that are affecting my community, and to be able to be that voice in the room, bring that social work perspective to the rooms where decisions are being made, where budgets are being spoken about, where the appropriation of resources and the allocation of resources is being discussed. This is wildly important if we want to make sustainable change as social workers. So there's plenty more, but basically, I wanted to make change. I wanted it to be fast. I wanted to impact a lot of people in the shortest amount of time. And that's how I got into social work policy and political social work.
Thank you so much, Justin. And then I'm going to ask a couple questions when you finish, Justin.
Okay, sounds good. So I have a bit of a different kind of intro into political social work. I started my social work career as a clinical social worker. So before pursuing my MSW, Louisa, I was actually a family support worker too at the Community Mental Health in my hometown, Lansing, Michigan. And then after I pursued my MSW, I wanted to be a clinician and I wanted to work at CMH. But during my time in the MSW program, I became increasingly interested in policy and politics as a vehicle for social change, but I was still really set on being a clinician. So I graduated and then ended up getting a job at Community Mental Health, and I worked there for a number of years in a bunch of different roles. I did home-based child and family therapy. I did case management for kids and adults with developmental disabilities. Eventually, I started to work primarily with suicidal teens. And then what pushed me to really get involved in policy and political work was I was working at Community dramatically cut the budgets to our CMH system. And the consequence for me with that was I was one of the many social workers that had to discharge a lot of clients, many of them without a clear transition plan. And our community mental health was one of the ones that was better off from the budget cuts. We didn't lose staff, and there were CMHs that had to lay off a lot of people, but it did significantly impact patient care. So from there, I started looking at, well, who are the people that allow this kind of thing to happen, and who are the people that tend to be in positions of power to make these hugely consequential impact on people's lives? It tends not to be social workers. So from there, I started looking at how can I be involved in the space and be able to, one, have a better understanding of where the change can be made and then where the decisions are being made. And for me, working for county government, It was what was interesting. The CMH I worked at was a CMH authority, so it served 3 different counties. So I started looking at the board of directors there, and it was made up of county commissioners from 3 different counties and then a few other elected officials. And I started to get more involved in getting appointed to local boards and commissions to be a social worker in that space, to be able to help guide change and create policy in that way. And I always recommend to my students that you look to get appointed to local boards and commissions, because that's a way for you to be able to affect policy without being an elected official. The example I always like to give is that one of the first boards I got appointed to was basically a civil rights board that was responsible for advising a city council member on social policy issues. And that allowed me the opportunity to be able to draft the resolution that made the city recognize Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day, and then worked with city council to move that through the process. So I really liked that work. And I did that while I was still working at Community Mental Health. And then got appointed to other local boards and commissions, and frequently, even the ones that you would expect, like Civil Rights Board or social policy focused boards, or ones that are over the distribution of federal dollars to local human service agencies, I was the only social worker in those spaces. So it really made me think about, well, one, it gets lonely being the only social worker doing that kind of work. How do we bring more people in? And it made me reflect on my time in my MSW program, which there were a few policy courses that I took, but it wasn't as robust as I would have liked it to have been. And I think that if there was more being done in social work education, that it would pull more social workers into the space earlier in their career. So then I started thinking about, because I had never planned to get into academia, but I started thinking about, well, if we want to change the social workers that are prepared for this kind of work, we have to do something different in academia. Really similar to Marla, that's what drew me into that work. I ended up did a bunch of research on policy and political social work, and then was able to teach a workshop at the University of Michigan School of Social Work for professional social workers for continuing education. It went really well, and then they asked me if I wanted to expand that into a continuing education certificate program. I was like, I got a plan for that, so we did it, and it's a program that anybody can participate in now. It's purely online, and then from there, it's like, I really like this teaching thing. And then other opportunities popped up for me to be able to do more with the School of Social Work. I eventually became an adjunct, and then the position I have now as a clinical assistant professor opened up. I applied for that and was able to get it. So along the way, I had the wild idea to run for county commissioner. I decided to do that because I'm really passionate about county government. In Michigan, I see county government as the level of government that has the highest level of impact on people's lives. When you think about services that are really integral to communities, like the public health department, for example, or community mental health, or our Office of Community and Economic Development, that's all county level services. And I wasn't, in 2018, I wasn't pleased with my current county commissioner. It was a person that wasn't really focused on the work of community mental health and made some decisions I didn't really like. So I decided to run against her, and she had been elected to basically everything that you could be elected to in the area, and was kind of riding out being county commissioner as a retirement thing. So I don't know if people know, but running against an incumbent is hard. So we didn't do terribly. We lost that election. We didn't do terribly. We got about 37.5% or so. Who's counting? And I knew I would run again in 2020 because I didn't expect any of the things that I was passionate about to be changed by the person I was running to replace. So I ended up running again in 2020, and it was an interesting campaign because it was during the height of the pandemic. But ultimately, we were successful, and then I ran for re-election, and then was successful again. And now I'm currently the chair of the Washtenaw County Board of Commissioners. So it was really the direct service work that I did that pointed me in the direction of looking at policy and politics as the way to make change. Because if we don't have people in the room making those kinds of decisions, you don't get the kind of services that communities need, particularly communities that are disenfranchised and ones that are not brought at the table. So that's how I got here.
Thanks, Justin. So a theme that's happening here is that this type of work, political, social work, democracy, civic engagement, it's been in your lives, your entire lives. So you've been doing this work in your family. So this is not something that just lives inside of a classroom. This is everywhere we go throughout our communities. So I wanted to ask you all, or whoever wants to answer this particular question, and I've got your question, Louise, so I'll get to you. I was wondering, for those students or for those people that have not grown up like this, I myself grew up, as a social worker. I was at rallies with my parents and very, social justice minded was part of my family. For those people who have not had those experiences or are at institutions where they might face some pushback on doing this type of work, for instance, when I began at NYU, I'm not there anymore, but I'm a macro person. I always taught policy classes, and it's a very clinical school. So kudos to you, Justin, for understanding the fact that I always tell my students, you need to use all your clinical skills at the boardroom table and in these spaces. So there's no such thing as either or. And that's how I would get through that bridge with the students. So what would you recommend for those who are either not necessarily inclined or have not had the exposure? Go ahead, Mimi.
Okay, so well, a couple of things. First, I just wanted to mention that I studied community organization at Columbia University, and I taught social policy at Silverman School of Social Work for many years. I just thought I'd throw that in. But one of the things that I think students could do now, in terms of your question, Darcy, is to there's a whole group, several organizations that are working inside the social work schools that are trying to balance the curricula and expose students who may be new to this work, as you suggest, to how they might get involved and the importance of political social work. We call it macro social work sometimes, and the importance of it, and then how to do it, the kind of work that you all are doing. I just want to mention those organizations to the people in the audience. And I work with all of them because social work is so clinical. 80% of the students are clinical. If you're lonely in the community spaces being a social worker, well, social policy and macro people are lonely in the social work education space because we are a distinct minority. Just to make that connection. So there's a group called, and all these groups have websites, a Special Commission to Advance Macro Practice, which has been trying to balance the curriculum so that both clinical and policy students get exposed to the kind of things that we are talking about today, maybe social policy and political social work. There's another group called the COSA, the Association for Community Organization and Social Action. And so they've been around a long time. They come out of the CEO space, but they work together, and they too are trying to advance macro practice among all social workers. And then there is the Influence in Social Policy, also been around a long time, and they work more on the policy front. So we have one coming out of CEO, one coming out of policy, and one coming out of education. And then there is Voting and Social Work, which kind of crosses through all of them. So if you're both clinical and macro students, should check out the websites of these places. If someone can put them in the chat for me, I'd appreciate that if you'd like to do that. And you'll meet people who will be like the people on this call who are doing these things either from scratch or because they came into school interested in it, which is also for me. I came in, as Marcy said, interested in it. So I just wanted to mention those things. There were resources available within the school if you didn't grow up in a family that promoted this.
Thank you. Marla, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I said in my intro that a big part of why I teach about political social work is to demystify it, right? To help students to understand that social workers have been involved in politics in the past, the history of us being involved and engaged and impactful. But I also, have noticed that a lot of my macro courses that I teach, my community organization course, for example, is filled with clinical students. 80% of our programs are clinical students, and 80% of my electives are, when they get a chance to take an elective, they want something that is meso macro because they don't have any experience in this space. So, I think when Darcy, your question was, how do you get involved and engaged? I feel that we're actually preaching to the choir here, because if they're on this call, if they're a part of CRISP, they're already have an interest. But what they can do is speak to their clinical classmates about this work, tie it to our code of ethics, standard 6.04, which talks about, the responsibility of social and political action of all social workers, not just macro students or, and really help them to understand the skills and the tools that they can benefit from as a clinician advocating for their clients. So I think that Mimi brought up some wonderful resources that I think would be helpful to really be a part of community when it comes to this work. Voting is Social Work. That website has so many ways of action, tools. It's a wonderful resource. That's number one. And number two, if you're ready to go to run, there's something called the Campaign School, which is critical because we want social workers to run. We want more Justins in the world, right? And then the last thing I would say is attend meetings. Go to a county commissioner meeting. Go to a city council meeting. Be involved in your civic associations or any advocacy group that is important to you. Attend events where people are already involved in this work, just so you can make those relationships and those connections, and then they will guide you, right? And then lastly, know your elected officials. Just send a simple email. I'm a social work student. I'm really involved in politics, and I would love to, meet with someone on your staff about X issue. They're just people, right? So just reach out and learn. And then C-SPAN is your friend. When you're having a boring time, sit there and watch Congress in action. You'll learn something.
I think that point that you touched on about demystifying it, that's also like my focus in teaching, because I think there's students perceive barriers to being able to do the work that really aren't there. I always preach about, get appointed local boards and commissions, and students will say, well, but I might, after I graduate, I might move. Okay, great. If you get appointed, then you're opening up a space if you move for somebody else to have the opportunity. But don't create these artificial barriers that keep you from participating. And then I also thinking about the 80% number of how many clinical students we have. We're not going to see the kind of change that we're hoping to see if our clinical colleagues are not involved in the space. I mean, that's such a large proportion of our field. We need to be working with our, like you said, tell your clinical classmates about here's how you get involved, because it really matters for their work too. Like for me, when I was a practicing clinical social worker, the policy decisions really affected my work. And if our clinical colleagues are not paying attention to that, it affects all kinds of things, reimbursement rates for insurance, for example. So there's a lot to be focused on and be interested in. And then also looking at our code of ethics, what I always tell clinical students when they're thinking about how do I fit doing this kind of thing into my life? Well, we're obligated to provide some amount of pro bono service per our code of ethics. Let this be volunteer on a campaign. Let that be part of your pro bono service, particularly so you can meet that ethical obligation to promote positive social and political change. So just get out there and do it. There are so many ways to volunteer on a campaign, volunteer for your local political party. I got a lot of my political experience from serving on the executive board for our county Democratic Party, for example. There's so many opportunities. And then you have the time. I mean, everything will fit. You're going to volunteer. Any campaign will take you for as much time as you have to give. So figure out how much time you have to give to it and then just do some volunteering. It's a great way to get started.
Thank you, Justin. We keep losing Louisa. As soon as she gets back on, I'm going to let her address that question as well. But you've all been talking about success stories, wonderful experiences. There you are, Louisa. So it's your turn.
Thank you. I don't have much to add. I feel like Mimi and Marla and Justin hit the points on the head. I will say and I'll reiterate, it's incredibly important to get in front of your elected officials and to get in front of opportunities that put you in front of elected officials. I'll give you an example. This weekend in New York City, there's going to be the Somos conference, which is the largest gathering of Latino elected officials in New York State. I'm bringing a cohort of social workers to that event and of social work students to that event to talk about the HEAL Act, which is something that we're very supportive of, and I'll talk about in a little bit. But opportunities like that are abundant. We just have to find them. We have to fund them. We have to make them happen for students and young professionals, so young social work professionals alike, so that social workers can get really comfortable in the advocacy space. so that we can get into those rooms and really put our expertise on show, on display. Nobody knows the issues more than social workers do. We're out there, we're out in the streets. We're working with the families, we're working with the groups. We know what we're talking about, and it would behoove elected officials and others that make decisions and policy decisions to listen to us. But we got to be in the space for them to listen to us. So find those opportunities. They are abundant, as I said. And you know, it's like Shirley Chisholm said, sometimes you gotta bring the folding chair, bring the table, bring the folding chair. If they don't exist, go knocking on some doors and see who you can talk to and get in front of.
Thank you. I find it important to not only hear all of these success stories of navigating these spaces, but also hear how you all as professionals have navigated more challenging experiences. So would anybody like to opine on that, just so that students can have a realistic idea of, like, sometimes it doesn't work out as easily as one would want it to. So how did you just share some stories that you might have had? I think Marla, you might have some stories to share.
Yeah, well, I'll give a quick one because I don't want to. I had stories, but I think the best challenge that I can speak to is how people devalue who we are and what we can bring as social work, right? And so, and I say that in the sense of they have this idea of social workers being caseworkers or child welfare workers. And when you're in a space where, you know, it is typically lawyers and public policy experts, they don't fully understand what an MSW brings. And so I was in a particular office and I was promoted to another position, a higher position. And my predecessor was making $30,000 more than I was. So I assumed with the new title and position that I would get the same salary. That did not happen. And so I went directly to the individual in charge and said, well, there must be some kind of discrepancy here because I'm doing the same work, you know, I'm in the same office and the salary is not the same. And I was told, well, he has a law degree. And so there's nothing in the job description that requires a law degree. That's number one. Number two, I have been doing this work for X amount of years with these skills that come with an MSW. I think the biggest challenge that we face in politics is helping people to understand what we bring when we are there and having them to see the value in that. Now, the end of the story is, oh, I got my money. Trust and believe. And that individual did not speak to me for 2 months because I went over his head and made it happen. So that's the other thing. Advocate for yourself, but know your worth. And I think sometimes a lot of individuals don't know our worth as a profession.
Yeah. Mimi or Justin?
Yeah, I would jump in and just talk a bit about, I mean, we'll talk about failures or not wins. I ran for office and lost. You know, it happens, right? And I think how do you bounce back from that is figure out what do you learn from it. I think you learn a lot more from a loss than you do a win, and understanding that bumps are going to happen along the road. But if you're really passionate and care about the work, you have to be able to pick yourself up. Take some time. I took a long break after I lost in 2018, but got back at it in 2020, and it really paid off. And I've been really happy with a lot of the things that I've been able to do since being in office so far. But it's you got to have like this vision of what does the long game look like, and being able to celebrate small wins along the way, and be able to stay in the game and keep yourself motivated.
Mimi's, your mic is off, Mimi.
Is it on?
Yes.
Oh, someone unmuted me. I didn't mute myself, but can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I said I'd like to save my time for the next round of questions stressed to democracy, and also because my work has been more in the academy and through my writing. So I have my worries about getting heard in different ways, but it doesn't really apply to this in the same way. If we were talking to a solely academic audience, it might be more things about tenure and things about publication and all that stuff. But I also am an activist, so I try to put the two together, and that hasn't always been simple. It's just one little struggle after another. But I'd like to save my time to talk more about the threats to democracy, which is what I've been struggling with now these days.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, I wanted to also mention one more thing, Darcy, before we go about political spaces. I think the biggest challenge is the uncertainty of if you're working for an elected official, will they get reelected? The stability is not there, right? If you're working hard on a campaign and the candidate doesn't win, there aren't opportunities at the end. And so, knowing that getting involved in political social work can sometimes bring a lot of risk when it comes to employment.
Thank you. It's true. Luis, I wanted to ask you before your computer, which might indeed be cursed, I wanted to ask you if you wanted to talk about the relationship of your coalition with political advocacy in the same vein as what Marlo is just saying.
Certainly.
So-
So yeah, thank you, Dr. Merritt. So I serve as president of the Latino Social Work Coalition. For 22 years, we've been ringing the alarm on the alarming shortage of Latino and bilingual social workers in the field. This has been brought into sharp relief by the pandemic. We saw in communities of color, particularly in New York City, that they were the hardest hit by COVID-19. Communities like Elmhurst, Queens, Washington Heights, the South Bronx, East Harlem, where I reside. These are all communities that could have used and the support of culturally competent, linguistically competent social workers. So one of the initiatives that the coalition is currently participating in New York State is promoting the HEAL Act and working with NASW, working with advocates, with other leaders in the field to call attention to the fact that the pass rates of the licensing exam, the initial licensing exam, disproportionately affect negatively prospective social workers of color. They are just not passing the test at the same rates as other people, and it's a problem because our communities need social workers. We know that folks are in mental health crisis in addition to every other crisis that communities of color are constantly facing, and we need the social workers that know how to work with those communities, that are culturally competent enough to work in those communities to be there. And right now they are not. So one of the things that we've been working on is really crafting a bill that will facilitate more social workers to enter the profession so that they can do that work. As I mentioned before, the coalition has been very active in getting social workers into those rooms to tell their narratives, to talk about how it's taken them 5 exams to pass the test, how it's taken them years and years of study and stress and strife and heartbreak to get through the initial licensing exam. So that's just one of the ways that the coalition really enters this political advocacy space, gives people the opportunity to hone in on those political advocacy skills, and gives social workers the arena in which to promote the well-being of our communities.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So I think now let's switch over and allow Mimi, if you want to talk about democracy, threats to democracy, and give you that space.
Okay, great. Yes. So, I am a member of the Social Work Democracy Group, like everyone else here, and the threats to democracy have gotten very, very serious. And I want to talk a little bit about what they are, because I don't think enough social workers are in an everyday way aware of them, at least in my experience in talking to people that they haven't been. And so I come at this from because I coach here, as I said, the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign, better known as Voting as Social Work. And I have to tell you, I'm more worried than ever about the threats to democracy in the US and around the world. Yesterday was the 58th anniversary of the 1965 March in Selma, Alabama for the right to vote. 58 years. Today it's 2023 and we're still fighting for it. I want to step back and reflect on what's going on in this attack on democracy. Because if you ask me what my struggle is now, my struggle is one to see what social work can do to get into the struggle to protect our democracy. And as I said earlier, we can't do it in the same old way. It's not enough just to propose reforms, because those reforms are being structurally, the opportunity to engage in those reforms are being structurally undermined every day by new laws. And I'm going to mention some of them. So now we're social workers and we excel. We're really, really good at diagnosing individual and social problems, right? Yet, along with many Americans, we are not always comfortable or even ready to assess the status of our democratic institutions. The people in this room and on this webinar are, because you've been doing it, but many are not. And to ignore the reality of today's political context creates an overly rosy view of democracy. So we need to up our game, and I want to talk about that for a little bit. First of all, you all know that voting rights and democracy go hand in hand. Yet, in 2022, the Democracy Index, which measures countries' status, found that only 24 countries representing 8% of the world's population lived in what they call a full democracy based on their criteria, down from 8.9% in 2015. Since 2016, the US has ranked as a flawed democracy. We were a full democracy before that. We fall below Tunisia and Liberia. Just imagine that. We sit between democracy and authoritarianism, according to this index prepared by The Economist, a British publication. And we were warned. There's a book called How Democracies Die, and two political science identify 4 warning signs of how democracies in trouble. And then they add a lot of meat on the bones, which I don't have time for. 1, they reject the democratic norms or rules of the game. They deny the legitimacy of political opponents. They curtail opponents' civil liberties, including the media, and they tolerate and encourage violence. If you've been paying attention, nearly all the signs are evident in the US today, every one of them. The authors conclude that democracy does not necessarily end with a bang, a violent military revolution, or by a coup. Rather, it ends with a whimper, the slow, steady weakening of critical institutions like the vote. Barbara Walter wrote a book called How Civil Wars Start. So her book adds another warning. She does the history of civil wars and how do they start. So when you hear that, you say, oh, well, that's not going to happen here. Not until Marjorie Taylor Greene called for the divorce between the red and the blue states a few weeks ago. We must heed this warning. And maybe I'm a bit of an alarmist, but no longer, because a New York columnist agreed that we have to heed this. David French last week urged us to take the threats of a national divorce seriously. The current attack on voting rights is not new, and that's why we have to take it seriously. This is a repeat performance. From Reconstruction to the election of the first Black president, voting right, each voting rights victory, each victory of those civil rights movement, the suffrage movement, the labor movement, sparked a backlash designed to protect white, then you could say class and male supremacy. The current backlash includes voter suppression. This is, most of you know about this, designed to keep people from voting. Advocates tell voters that the system is rigged, makes people believe their vote does not count or does not matter. In 2022, lawmakers in 39 states considered at least 408 restrictive bills, up from 75 in 24 states in 2021. This is why I'm worried. Then there's something called election subversion or elective interference, which many people don't use that term or even know what it is. It's less visible, but more insidious. because it interferes with the administration of elections and overrides the will of the people. And that's what I was referring about, how we have to get smart about the way we do our reforms. It's because of these election subversions. What do? They replace existing election administrators with highly partisan officials. They substitute preferred candidates for those the voters choose. They damage the legitimacy of and trust in the government in a democratic process. And the Republican Party is leading this campaign, and they're very good at it, and they're having a lot of success. In 2022, 27 states considered 151 bills to subvert, overturn, or otherwise override the will of the voters, up from 148 in 2021. And make no mistake, it's going to be worse in 2024, all the elections that we're heading into. The third problem is gerrymandering, which since the 2020 census, states withdrew district lines, creating racially gerrymandered maps that systematically disenfranchise Black and Latinx voters. You know about gerrymandering, but the other voter suppression is less known to most people. And along the way, the Supreme Court eviscerated the Voting Rights Act, not to mention abortion and many other rights. And keep your eye on that docket, because we're going to lose a lot of other rights. And now I just want to add that the threats go beyond voting. It's not just a vote that we have to worry about. The conditions in which we live and work in are really changing. First, there's book banning. I never thought I would live to see the day when America books were being banned. Since January 2022, 39 states have introduced more than 150 bills to restrict teaching about race, gender, any topic that can make students, quote, uncomfortable. These are called by some educational gag orders, but schools are firing those who resist. And they also, these laws are not just for public secondary, target higher education. And it's not just DeSantis. At least 25 states have done the same thing he's done in relationship to higher education, where we all sit. Schools have fired faculty, canceled courses, and probably the most insidious of all, faculty, and I think practitioners in the field, are starting to self-censor. And if you self-censor, you're doing the work of our opponents for us. They don't have to lift a finger. It's called the chilling effect. And this is doubly important for us because our hard-won anti-racist and social justice agenda is now at high risk given these changes. Then there's the press is much less independent. In the last 50 years, the number of daily papers has fallen by 28%. Investigative journalists down 50%. Meanwhile, large media corporations own 80% of all the daily newspapers. Trust in government. In 1960, 3/4 of the Americans trusted the federal government, always or most of the time. Today, it's less than 25%, an all-time low. How are we going to, by working for government, get things to change if people have been taught not to trust the government? This is part of the changed context, in addition to governors and state legislators playing a different game, trying to undermine democracy. The stakes could not be higher. Today's opponents of democracy are following the authoritarian playbook. And it's not just me. I hear this every day on the news, TV news, when I listen to it. They talk about this in those words. So the authoritarian playbook plays to insecurities, stoke hatred, silence dissent, and they do this to intentionally generate distrust, confuse the people, destabilize society, and otherwise create the conditions for authoritarianism. That's how authoritarianism takes roots. Just look at the countries around the world that have authoritarian or dictator leadership. That's how they got there. All right, so we can and we must help strengthen our flawed democratic institutions. Why? Well, first, it's the right thing to do, as everyone here has said. It supports the profession's mission and social justice values, ditto. And we are in the right place. I think Justin in particular mentioned this. Social workers sit at the intersection of the individual and society. We are best positioned to witness the harms brought by a faltering democracy and bring civic participation into the classroom, voter registration into the field, and human rights into the United States. And we can do it. We can do it. Never forget, and this is really important as we go through these really troubling times, what has been done can be undone. You're all trying to, on the field, you're on the ground trying to undo what has been done. It can be undone. We can and must, as John Lewis said, make some good trouble. We can support fair and inclusive public policies. We can show how government meets common human needs. We can and we must organize, organize, organize. Joe Hill, a labor organizer for many years, a long time ago, said, don't mourn, organize. And I think that's a good reminder. And I'd like to end by saying, please be part of history. Imagine if all 700,000 social workers each registered 3 people and they voted, and they registered 3 more, and so on. No need to imagine. You can join Voting as Social Work's Power of 3 campaign. Go to our website, make a pledge to work with us, and you can join the campaign there. And finally, one last word. Supreme Court Justice Brandeis told us many years ago, we can either have democracy in this country or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we cannot have both. So let me go back to Joe Hill. Don't mourn, organize. Remember the power of social movements. Progress does not occur without a struggle. Thank you for the chance to get this off my chest.
Thank you so much, Mimi. That was a lot. And so it brings me to the level of apathy that is pervasive amongst our society, and people's also unwillingness to be savvy with correct information. So speaking about the skills that social work students are learning, especially when 80% of them are on clinical tracks, how can we give them tips and tactics to mediate competing positions in these spaces where people seem to not have any care or desire to acknowledge the urgency that Mimi just laid out? Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what we're thinking about with that question is information literacy, making sure that students have knowledge around how do I find good and accurate sources of news. I always like to ask my students, how do you primarily get your news? And every year, the number that say I get it all on Twitter or I get it all on some other social media platform continues to increase. And there are concerns around that, particularly given the state of Twitter now and how Elon Musk has rolled back some of the protections that were put in place. So I think knowing that that's the ecosystem that we're operating in, we have to be better about helping students figure out, okay, you may find this thing on Twitter. Here's how you can figure out if it's a reputable source or not. But I think that piece of it, if people are operating with differing sets of information, they're really operating in different realities. And it's really hard to have a conversation across different realities. So it's on us, I think, to make sure that we're helping to get accurate information out there and teaching people the skills to be literate in finding their information.
Well, I can say if no one else has anything to say right now, that when I was teaching, for years and years and years, I taught social policy, introduction to social policy. The first course that our students took, I taught them 9 o'clock in the morning, so I got them fresh, first year students. And I always had several units on called ideological perspectives. And it was just as Justin said, I didn't frame it that way, but that's what it was, informational literacy. I tried to detail what liberalism is, what conservatism is, what radicalism, and now what populist authoritarianism is. And so they could hear, so they could begin to understand the language of the arguments that they're hearing in whatever their media sources are. So we give them code words. There's certain words that come all the time in certain ideological discourses. So trying to make students familiar with that. And then I would ask them I had them take an ideological quiz and where did they stand? And they always said, oh, I thought I was radical, but I'm liberal, or I thought I was liberal and I'm much more conservative. So they began to self-assess, they began to hear the arguments. And then when you read the newspaper, this is how I learned these arguments. When you read the newspapers and you say, oh, that sounds like what conservatism is, and that sounds like liberalism is, and so on. Now, those are broad terms, and everything exists in the cracks between them. But you do have these sort of paradigms. They have guided social policy in the United States from the start, from the colonial poor laws to today's neoliberal policies, those ideological debates, how much state, how much the government should be involved, what the role of the market should be, and who's to blame for our social problems, those arguments have been the same for 200 years.
Thank you. Marla, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that lack of trust that Mimi brought up in her discussion about the threats to democracy, and how that lack of trust is one of the reasons why the apathy exists. And I think that the way to counter that is by having individuals in office that represent the population that doesn't feel as though they're represented. So, why engage in an activity that you think is worthless? But if someone is in there that looks like you, that speaks your values, that motivates you to want to get involved and engaged. And so, I as a professor, I'm always bringing to the students' attention unorthodox or not typical candidates. Maxwell Frost, young congressman, 25 years old from Florida, a state senator in the state of Delaware, Sarah McBride, the first out trans state senator in the country, trying to show them that politics is not your grandfather's game. This is your life on the line, and that, it can be something that you can engage in. So I think that, helping to get elected more people that look like more people is going to be one way that we can address the issue of apathy. The second thing regarding shaping the narrative of, it being negative or that energy that it really forces people to not want to engage in politics, I think it's important that, we understand in this 21st century, like we were talking about, Twitter, Instagram, Reels, TikTok, all of that, influencers are more important than the Peter Jennings of our day. So, understanding the power of a hashtag, we, as in the Gen Xers, the baby boomers, need to understand how to communicate to the millennials and the Gen Zs, because when they are involved and engaged in the political process, social policies are protected. When they are involved and engaged, we see elections that favor or are in alignment with our values. That just happened in this last midterm election. It was the young vote that turned the tide in many states where we really needed for that to happen. And, people always say, well, but they're still not voting at the rate of other generations. They may not be, but they're voting at a higher rate than other young voters at different times. So they're more engaged than they were before. And I think that's how we're going to change the tide, by teaching them how to communicate and organize through social media and the way or the ways that they get information, instead of trying to force our values and beliefs on the way that we always got our information.
Very
Thanks,
quickly,
Marla.
Darcy.
Go ahead,
Very
Lisa.
quickly, I just want to add something about the apathy of people wanting to get involved and being more, wanting to know more. I think it's really important for young social workers, for young social work students and people that are entering the field to understand that they may not care about politics at any level, but their landlord does, and their employers do. And people who have a financial interest in anything in this country care about politics and who's making decisions and who's at the State House and who's at City Council. So are you going to sit around and let someone make decisions for you, for your clients, for the communities that you live in and you serve? Or are you going to knock some doors down and be at the table? so that decisions are made that actually benefit you and people that look like you and people that care about the things that you care about and share your values. That is a point that I make often to young social workers that come to the coalition and that I speak to, because I hear it a lot. Well, I don't care about that. I want to work with, I want to work with kids. I want to work with people who have substance use disorder. I want to work with elderly. I want to work with people in hospitals. That's great. But you know who's caring about who the nearest elected official is? The person who runs the hospital, the person who runs the school, the person who determines how much you get paid for the work that you do. So yes, there's apathy, but we have to do a better job of making advocacy sexy, I think, because a lot of folks think that it's boring, that it has nothing to do with them. But in reality, it affects every single facet of their education and every single facet of their social work career.
I would add on to that and say that I think it's really easy to be apathetic about things that happen at the federal level. Things move really slowly. And I think the awesome work that happens in local and county governments is often not something that people are paying attention to. And if more people are engaged at the local level, they would see things can move fairly quickly, and you can see the really impactful decisions, positive or negative, happen. We talked briefly earlier around book banning. There's a library in Michigan, it's not in my county, that there was a very vocal group that would attend library board meetings. And so in many places, library boards are elected offices. So that's something people need to be paying attention to, just like school boards are. But there was this big push to try to get members of a library board to ban certain books. They held strong and didn't do that. But then that same group of people coalesced around the anger around that and then campaigned against the library's millage renewal and were successful. And as a consequence, that library is going to shut down because they're not going to have the funds to continue to operate. So that's, right in the heart of a community. People need to be able to pay attention to that kind of stuff. And I would say, like, a library shutting down is not sexy, but it's dangerous, and it's something that we need to be paying attention to. And if you see that, and if you see the work that I'd say county health departments did at the height of the pandemic to get vaccines out into communities and thinking about how do you come up with a strategy to do that? We were really purposeful in making sure that we were connecting with community leaders, trusted community leaders, so we could target areas that we knew where there were higher rates of COVID, which tended to be lower socioeconomic status areas, Black and brown communities. But that was all strategy that was developed at the county, and we were really successful in getting vaccines out. So it's just, don't just look at federal government. We have to look at all the other levels of government.
Go ahead, Mimi. Thank you, Justin.
So, yeah, this is really important because what it really gets to in overall is the connection between policy and practice. And we don't do a good enough job of teaching that in social work education because we have our policy classes and we have our practice classes. And so when students, I know just what you're talking about, Louisa. I want to help people. And they pick populations they want to help because of their own experience or a story they've read and so on. And so I think what everyone's said is that we have to do a better job of telling not just those students when we're asked, but writing about and talking about that the budget, for example, whether it's local, state, or federal, affects your ability to help a substance abuser, affects your ability, your agencies to hire more staff, affects your ability to have time to reduce the speed up that's taking place in agencies that reduces the amount of time any social worker can spend with their clients. And so, words are cheap. My mother used to say talk is cheap, and it is, but I don't know how we need to figure out how to make that dramatic and sexy, as Louisa said, because that is the key of social work. Social work is, as I said, sits between the individual and society. So if you're a social worker, you have to care about the individual, which we're good at most of the time, and society, which is social policy, social structures. And what Justin just said, that library board, the opponents of democracy, which is who they are, were able to shut down the library. That's an institution. It's not just a person being, canceled. It's an institution being canceled, or voters being canceled, or courts are being canceled. And so, and faculty, what I'm really worried about now, for many of you here teach, that we have to really watch out for silencing ourselves. If you're pre-tenure, you're not going to want to talk about anti-racism. You're going to get scared, right? And you have to not let that happen. You have to build support in your faculty to get the support you need. So anyway, policy and practice. All these book banning is a policy. Loss of trust in government is due to policies of the government cutting all our programs. The connections are endless. And so maybe our group, the Social Work Democracy Project, can come up a way to talk about, promoting democracy by linking policy and practice, and put together some kind of document about all the things that we're talking about. Because that's what we're doing here.
Yeah, I appreciate all of these comments. And so to segue from what we were talking about in the conversation, the narrative, I want to be a little provocative, although it shouldn't be provocative at all. But we know that social workers are not a heterogeneous group, yes? And so I don't think that we're all on the same page of being mindful of our privilege and our positionality. And so how do we encourage students and others to really be intentionally mindful of how one's positionality either silences or allows one to come to these tables, but not only sit at the table, but actually speak and eat at the table? So what is our responsibility?
I'll start and I'll keep it brief. I know we're running down on time. I think that if you have the privilege and the power and the ability to be invited to these tables, to make your way to them, bring people with you and make space for other folks who may not have that same privilege. There are, for example, here in New York, there are many advocacy groups on many different issues. There's an advocacy group for every issue out there. And when they make it through and are in a position to advise and to shape policy, there's a lot of coalition building that happens, because we know that one issue is not just one issue, especially when it comes to the appropriation of money, the assignment of money in a budget. I think that there is a lot of room for there to be coalition building, for different groups to coalesce around issues that affect not just one particular group of people or one particular kind of person, but different policy areas and different areas of being. So I think coalition building is really important, and being intentional about that, and looking around and seeing who's not there. Who's missing from this room that can bring a valuable point, that can make a valuable suggestion, that has a different viewpoint that I myself, because it's not my experience, or I haven't lived that, or it's not something that I have any expertise in, there's really no, I'm just taking up space here when someone else could have been brought in to drive the point home. So I think you have to be intentional, and you have to be willing to work with others and make room for them to do that.
Thanks, Louisa. Does anyone else want to chime in on that?
Well, I can. Just briefly, as a white person, I have lots of privilege, unearned privilege. Okay, I'm quite aware of that. I was very active in the welfare rights movement for many years. And so one of the things we did in consultation with the welfare rights mothers was we defined ourselves as allies. We stepped back. And we didn't try to run the show. We had to learn that, because that was a big problem in low-income groups, when liberal people like us come in and we sort of take over. And so we learned not to do that. I can't say everybody did, but I think that's a good concept that we can apply. Bring people to the table, as Louisa said, when you're in a position to do that, regardless of what your race or ethnicity, but if you have the power to get into the room, bring others with you. And then for people who have privilege, stand back. I'm a big talker, you can tell. Whenever I'm on one of these groups, I talk a lot, and you've all heard me, and I'm doing it now. But I'm aware of that. But I feel like I'm, anyway, I feel sometimes I try to self-correct, but I'm not always good at it. But working with groups, collectively, people who can't tell me to shut up, it's a really good way to really step back. And I have to say, it isn't easy to do, because things may move slower than you want, or in a different direction that you want. But it's a way to manage privilege.
I wanted to piggyback off of that, and Mimi, I appreciate your awareness of your privilege. It's funny, someone gave a presentation on our campus, and they spoke of being aware of their privilege, and then it stopped there. And I was like, okay, but that's not enough. Liberatory consciousness goes from awareness to allyship, like what you just said. Really understanding when to step back. And I think, also as someone of privilege, I have political privilege. I know people in high places. I can access information in ways that others cannot. So how do you leverage that privilege, right? You go past allyship to being a co-conspirator, meaning that you're engaged in leaning in with your privilege, right, in order to make things happen. And so, for example, in this panel, Mimi legitimizes all of us because of who she is. She's a badass when it comes to this work. So, I mean, we're talking stuff, but she's done stuff, and we've done stuff too. But her as a white woman that is respected in the academy legitimizes us. And that's what you can do with your privilege. With your MSW, you legitimize some communities, right? So it's leveraging that privilege that is power. That's the power that you have sometimes is being of a privileged group. And then I think the last thing though is what does allyship really mean, right? Because it's more than helping us get to the room, or using your intellectual prowess to get things done, but thinking about it every day. How can I live out allyship? How can I really live it out every day? That to me is a true ally. Oh,
Thanks, Marla.
Mimi's muted.
Oh,
Thank you for those kind words, Marla.
okay. So we have about 10 more minutes before the close of this, and I thought it'd be prudent to allow everybody to provide some closing remarks and what you want our audience to have as their take-home message. So anybody want to jump in?
I can go ahead and start. I would say that part of our conversation focused on threats to democracy and what we can do about it. And democracy dies when people are not engaged. And our attempts to maintain a representative democracy is only going to work when we have elected officials that are truly representative of the communities that they're serving. And you only get that through engagement. So I would say I'd echo what I said earlier about find the ways that work for you to get engaged. Think about how much time you have, and there's going to be a thing that you can do with the amount of time that you have to really plug in and get engaged. The other thing I would think about, and this frequently comes up in class, where I think social workers tend to have a negative connotation associated with power, and we have to get over that. And politics is how we've decided to distribute power within our society. And if we're going to make any kind of sustained and meaningful change in our society, social workers have to be more comfortable thinking about how they wield power and accept that they do. Because whether or not you accept that you wield power or have power, you do have it. I mean, you can think about a social worker that works for Child Protective Services, for example. If you're a social worker doing that kind of work and you're not conscious of the power that you wield or can wield, you'll do something that you don't want to do, or something you'll miswield that power. So thinking about that and figuring out where do you plug in and being conscious about wielding power in an appropriate way is the take-home message I would like to give.
Thanks, Justin. Who would like to close out next?
I'll go next. Marla, did you want to go?
No, I'm after you, Louisa. I'm still.
No worries. I'll keep it brief. I think everybody should do their part to think really intentionally about how social work intersects with policy, with advocacy, and with politics. I said it, before, things like budgets, things like who makes decisions at the municipal level, at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. These are things that impact all of us in our careers and in the communities that we have chosen to serve. So it would behoove all social workers, whether you just started yesterday or you've been in the field for 50 years, to really pay attention to that and to find the ways that you can get involved that are sustainable for you. Not everybody can devote an entire weekend to advocacy, and that's perfectly fine. But finding the ways that you can make an impact, not just for the profession, but for the communities that you serve, has to be really intentional. And you have a lot of power. We have a lot of power. Social workers know how to talk to people, know how to convince people. It's time that we use that power. Don't be afraid of it. And it's not a mystery. Yes, it's helpful to know people. It's helpful to be connected. It's helpful to know who the players are, but you don't need any of that to start. And I see Marla shaking her head, so she may have something to say about that, but that's really the point. That's really the point. Don't be afraid of this magical, mystical thing called political social work. I promise you it is not. And anybody can get involved. If there is an issue in your community, in the community that you work in, that you want to solve, that you want to see fixed, I promise you political advocacy is the quickest way to get the fastest solutions for the most amount of people.
Well, I will go next so we can have Mimi finish us off. And I don't disagree with you, Louisa. You don't have to know people to get started, but you surely will have a whole Rolodex once you get started, because people are connected. And as our code of ethics states, the importance of human relationships are everything when it comes to politics. So you don't have to have them, but you definitely will create them doing this work. So the things I'm going to quickly go through what I think are big takeaways. Know your representatives. Just know them. I'm not telling you to reach out to them, but get to know them. And I'm talking everybody from your city council person to your mayor to your state representatives, because you have state representatives and state senators. A lot that impacts you happens on the state and local level. Understand the politics that's happening on the ground in your town. Okay, that's number one. Know your representatives. Number two, like I said before, communicate with those non-macro social worker students. Let them understand, this world of policy and politics and how we fit in. And then the third thing is, I want to know your story. Figure out your story. Why are you doing social work? Because that story is going to be the thing that you use to affect policy. That story is what it makes people want to work with you. And then the last thing is, I want you to use your social media today, right now. Get out there, put it out in your universe that you're doing this, that this is something that you believe, and do hashtag political social work matters. Hashtag. Let's make it trend, right? Because look, I just want to share with you that in this NPR article, it says that 61% of Gen Zers get their information from TikTok, 51% from Instagram, 43% from Snapchat, and 35% from Twitter, 33% from Facebook. This is where you guys communicate. We want to shape the narrative about who we are and what we're doing. We want to make it something that's trending. So it's up to you. Get on social media, make it useful. And then the last thing is, get on LinkedIn. If you want to connect with any of us, we're all on LinkedIn, but you have to build your network. That's it.
So I'm going to go back to some things I also said before. I'm going to share some of my favorite quotes, which I hope those are listening, as Marla suggested, put these out on social media. They're good for social media because they're short. First of all, John Lewis, let's make some good trouble. Make good trouble. Everything we've been talking about can fall into that basket. Good trouble. Second, Frederick Douglass, there is no progress without struggle. Put that out on social media. Say, social workers say there is no progress without struggle. And then we say, power seeks nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. if we get that message across and we begin to organize and we begin to build our social movements, we will, all the things that we're trying to do will be much more successful.
Thank you so much, Mimi. Well, this has been an enriching conversation. I don't know if Charles is going to pop back in to say some last words. If not, is there anything else that you didn't get to share that you'd like to before we close out? It's been a powerful conversation. I've been really appreciative of it. And I'm sure you've encouraged a lot of social workers out there to get involved as a necessity, as a responsibility.
Maybe you'd like to say something.
No, I'm just the moderator. I'm just.
But you have a minute or two if you want to put a word or two in of your own.
No, I just think that it's critical. And what I would wish for is that this training and encouragement was codified more in our schools of social work. I came from a more macro-oriented graduate program, and so I was required to take community organizing. I've always been like on the macro side, but understood the importance of my clinical skills in order to navigate those spaces. So I see it as a responsibility, and I just feel like it's very important to notice, as I said earlier, our positionalities play a big role in how we can even access these spaces. So it is important for those with more privilege to bring along those who have less privilege. So that's all I would have to say. And it needs to be a priority. It's a priority in my life. This isn't just something that stays in the classroom or that you do as a project. We need to live this in order to save our democracy, because Mimi laid out a pretty dismal trajectory we're on currently.
Darcy, I wanted to share just a thought going back to the threats to democracy. In January 6, 2021, when the insurrection happened on the Capitol, everyone in this country had the opportunity to see how fragile our democracy was, and how important it is that we become involved. But I had a personal connection to that day for two reasons. Number one, I was selected to be an elector in Delaware, one of three that certified the election. And so my votes, my signature was in that box that they were trying to stop it being certified. But the second reason was because my sister, Congresswoman from Delaware, was trapped in the gallery at the time of the insurrection. And I was watching her on television as they were being, shots were being fired and they were putting on gas masks. We should never have had to live through that as a country. And if people don't think that there are real threats that Mimi laid out for us, just go back to January 6th. That can happen again. So, you might want to get involved.
Thanks, Marla. That's very disturbing. Okay. Well, on that note, your charge, all of you, is to go out and get involved. It's your assignment. You will all receive Fs if you don't.
Thank you, Marcy, for this leading us into this great discussion.
Okay, everybody. It's nice to see you, colleagues, and have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.
Take care.
Guess we don't know quite how to exit this one.
Yeah, I'm like,
Studio. It's down at the bottom, on the bottom right-hand corner. There's a red dot.
okay, goodbye, guys.